We are picking back up in Exodus 14. So we're going to pick up in Exodus 14, beginning in verse 10. We got all the way through 9 and some of the way into the next section of the questions that they ask in response to the Egyptians coming upon them. And so we're going to continue that narrative. And again, I don't want to make any false promises, but I'm prepared to go all the way through chapter 32. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to do our best to get through a great majority of the Red Sea, the parting of the Red Sea, in preparation for the study of the song by the sea, or Moses' song of God's warrior status. I say that kind of facetiously because it's a cool title. Anyway, so as we dive back in, I want us to start with verse 1 of chapter 14 and read pretty much all the way to the end. And again, our topic of study is going to be jumping off in verse 10. So would somebody be willing to read verses 1 through 9 for us? Okay.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel to turn back and encamp in front of Pihahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord." And they did so. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them and camped at the sea, by Pihahiroth in front of Baal-zephon.
Awesome. Somebody pick up and go from 10 to verse 18.
Okay.
All right.
When the Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, and they said to Moses, "It is because there are no graves in Egypt. Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us to bring us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward. Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians, so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots, and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen."
All right. Someone else take 19 through 25.
Then the angel of God who was going in front of the Israelite forces moved and went behind them. The pillar of cloud moved from in front of them and stood behind them. It came between the Egyptian and the Israelite forces. The cloud was there in the darkness, yet it lit up the night. So neither group came near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back with a powerful east wind all that night, and turned the sea into dry land, so the waters were divided. And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. The Egyptians set out in pursuit, all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen, and went into the sea after them. Then during the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian forces from the pillar of fire and cloud and threw them into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve and made them drive with difficulty. Let's get away from Israel, the Egyptians said, because Yahweh is fighting for them against Egypt.
Okay. And somebody finish this out.
Then the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Of all the hosts of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the people of Israel walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord and they believed in the Lord and in his miracles.
Okay, awesome. So again, we're picking back up in verse 10. And so let me go ahead and share this PowerPoint with everybody. There we go. And as we pick it back up in verse 10, what are some things that we have traversed in verses 1 to 9? What's some of the concepts that we kind of pulled out last week?
Sorry, I was saying I wasn't here, I get it fast.
Well, we were saying Pharaoh thought he had him, thought he had the upper hand.
Yeah, that's right. So Pharaoh thought he had him, which kind of led him to be baited into chasing after them, right? Because they were going to go up north by the way of the Philistines, if we're in the end of last chapter, but yet the Lord drove them south and really put them in a tactical disadvantaged place. And we kind of talked through the reality of what God, in God doing that, A, was it okay for God to do that? And B, what was God seeking to accomplish in doing that, right? And intentionally driving them into a place of vulnerability, and then essentially leaving them there for the Egyptians to come upon them in their rear, like behind them. And so as we kind of unpack this going forward, it's important for us to kind of keep that in mind, because that's what is the content of all these questions starting going forward in verse 10. So when Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. All right, so they cried out to the Lord, and then they blamed Moses, right? And they said to Moses, is it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in this wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. All right, so they're questioning a couple of things. We talked through a little bit about this last week, but I wanted to kind of nail it again. What are they actually questioning?
Lord's direction.
Yeah, they're questioning God and his direction that he has given through Moses. Mm-hmm. What about God are they questioning?
Whether or not he can save them.
Yeah, his ability, his goodness, his ability, his power. Now, I don't know about you guys, but after seeing some of the plagues that he's kind of unleashed on the Egyptians, it seems like a high-handed reality to then question him and his ability to save them from 600 people, mm-hmm. when he basically brought to their knees an entire mega city, essentially, in Egypt. I mean, it seems kind of far-fetched that they would be so short-sighted.
But there's an army in front of us. What's that ancient history?
Right, yeah.
I think the craziest part though is there's an army in front of them, but there's also a giant pillar of fire. Like, how blind can you be?
Right, well, yeah, and at this point that they're questioning Moses, there's like this, they're still being led to the sea and they're kind of encamped or entrenched there. And it's actually using some militaristic type of language. Like they're entrenched by the sea. You guys are familiar with that type of terminology militarily, right? And as they are there, they turn around and lift up their eyes and they're like, oh no, like they've chasing after us, right? And so now they're just kind of like, what in the world? They're questioning God's not only his ability, his power, but his wisdom in many cases, and Moses' leadership. How in the world would they ever, if they were smart, how would they let us get into a position such as this? Right?
In all fairness, God does have them in a serious position of disadvantagement.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And God did have them leave Egypt in a hurry. They don't have a lot of supplies. They don't have they're not prepared for an extremely long journey. They're seriously depending on God for not only the guidance, with a pillar of fire and all that, but also what's happening. They're entirely dependent on him. So all of a sudden, this is one of those moments where you're like, I can't do anything if all logic dictates that we're going to die here. And so it's not that they're incredibly stupid. It's just logically, this is what's going to happen. It points to the nature of the type of faith that God designs for us, and the type of world that God has designed for us. That it's not doesn't necessarily line up with the way the world operates as we understand it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And so as we kind of, again, these questions are very penetrating, right? And just very telling of what they really think, right? Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? Like that just seems so morbid, like completely absent of any faith that they have demonstrated before. Like their death, as John is pointing out, their death is almost as certain to them as the army that is before them. And that's an intense feeling, right? I'm about to die. Like this is not going to be cool. And I've been led to this point by a person who says that he's following the God that I'm just kind of getting reacquainted with. like it's not like they've been, hi-ho cheerio with God for the past 400 years in slavery, right? Some of them maybe, but they certainly would, as demonstrated later in the book of Exodus that we will see, they certainly messed around or dabbled in the gods of Egypt, and at least had an understanding and worshiping them. As again with the golden calf, I think we see that primarily. So they're actually just saying, well, this is it, boys. We made it to the sea. Cool. Let's die now. Then he says, why have you done this to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Again, a very similar question to what they will ask later, right? Wasn't it just so much better, just particularly when they were in the wilderness, right? Wasn't it so much better when we were in Egypt? Why did God even bring us up out of here, right? We had leeks and onions to eat, at least in Egypt, but now we're going to die of hunger, right? So this smacks of the same type of discontentment and mistrust in God. The next one is very interesting because it throws back to what they said previously to Moses, right? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. And this kind of gets to the second point that I have up on the PowerPoint. I kind of tried to create like some beatitude like sounding things, but I probably failed horribly. Anyway, better are the enslaved, for they will not die. So essentially, their premier goal is not death, right? They would rather be enslaved than to be dead here in the wilderness. Is essentially what these questions are getting at. Anybody see a problem with that?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
I just kind of had some hopelessness of it, of like they truly have no hope for a better life than enslavement. Like they can't picture happiness, but they're just like, it's slavery or death. Like they have no even like idea in their head of this could be a good thing, that we could find our own home, we could find something good and happy and build our own life. Like it's just those two options in their head.
Yeah, and that it's so sad because the reality is that they stand in a lineage of promises. Right? What are those promises that they've been given? Exactly what Joanna was talking about, right? That they have lack of. They can't see the fact that there is a home for them waiting at the end of this trek or journey. They can't see that this is a God who has promised to care for them and comfort them and continue to be with them. Why would they not be able to see that? Maybe.
Well, I mean, one of the biggest things is they don't see the future in the same way that God sees the future. They may have seen what God did in the plagues, and that was awesome. But for some of them the first time they've seen God really demonstrate Himself. And so it's like, okay, He did that. Is that the last thing He's ever going to do for us, and it's all over now? And the other part of it is, at least with slavery, they understood how that worked.
Right.
That in that world, if you were a good slave, you could avoid most of the beatings. You could at least have food. You at least have a place to live. Your family could be taken care of. It wouldn't be ideal. You wouldn't be happy. It would be hard work for your entire life, but it was a life.
Right.
Yeah. They made a home out of it. They found a way to make a home or to survive.
Yeah. So I think survive it. I think is a key. And then the truthfulness of that reality that they've created for themselves is that it's absent what God has for them, and that's what Moses has kind of been speaking to them. Like, this is not all that there is. God is going to take us up according to the promises given to your fathers. That there is a land that God will give us, and it seems as though, at least in these questions, they've all but forgotten those promises.
It's all philosophical. It's all like unseen. So, and they've been trained to think as slaves, where, you do know what you're doing that day. You've been ordered to X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And you do know where you're going to sleep at. There are certain things about your life and how you will survive. Yeah, but you take those two little comforts of need away, and it's hard to grasp the theoretical.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's bring that up again for us. How do we then apply this, at least this principle that we're seeing that they have not applied? But what are ways that we fail to do the same?
It's direct, right? We're living, believing in a God that we can't see with our physical eyes. Although you can argue there are things that can't be seen that are clearly function. And then we're living in the hope of a future with Him in heaven, whatever that's going to be, wherever that's going to be. And we're constantly distracted by our needs and our needs.
Yeah. Anybody else?
I was listening to a podcast while shelving books in the library, and he referred to the church as Israel in the wilderness, not where they're supposed to be. And there's a tendency to settle for you think that this is all you think that your life is something, but what God wants for you is so much more, right? You kind of by this point you kind of settle. I don't want to be like that in a prosperity thing, where we can. I don't mean it like that. It's much deeper.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And what you're hitting on, I think, and I imagine what the podcast was hitting on, is the reality that we get so stuck in sin and disappointment of our lives and everything that we fail to see that God has more for us than that sin, that disappointment, that discontentment, right? We fail to see those realities because we're so entrenched in the reality that we can only see. Yeah. I don't know if that was the podcaster's point, but that's the point I took.
That point now.
Okay. And so as we go ahead.
I mean, it's since April, being unemployed since April, and we finally found the shop. During that time, it's like, what am I supposed to do? God said He'd take care of us. we're not having any money coming in. Okay, well, we have some money coming from the government from that relief fund. Okay, that's good. Oh, unemployment, that comes in. But even unemployment ends and it has to be applied for, and then there's snags. And so there, for almost a month, we weren't getting any money from anybody until we were almost down to our last $100, and I just got this job. It was just reflecting the fact that during that time, I had intense doubt. I was scared. I was not sure. I wasn't sure what's going to happen next. I mean, I was always trusting God that He's going to provide for us. He's going to give us what we need. We're going to make it through this. That this fear is something that it doesn't define the situation. It's rather a symptom of going through what's going on here. But at the same time, that fear of like, what if it doesn't, is always there. It's always scary, and it's on the brink of driving you doing something that may not be wise and following God to the fullest extent. And you can see these Israelites being driven by that aspect of the fear. Like, I don't know, like, what can we do? Let's take the situation I have. Oh, wait, we don't have anything. We can't take the situation. We're just going to die.
Yeah, because we can't fight them. We don't have the ability. We don't have the resources. We don't have.
At the same time, I want just to observe too that the pursuit has changed, right? Like they were pursuing a land where they were going to enter in that was physical. They had a promise. Like, whereas some of us, right, like, and that's why I didn't say I wanted to be careful about the prosperity thing. Some of us might hear that and be like, oh, well, I don't have a job now, but I'll have one. Like, what if you don't?
Yeah.
Like, then does that mean that God left you in the wilderness?
Right.
I would just say that the pursuit is not this world, but heaven, right? The new heaven, the new earth. Like, that's the pursuit. That it's not up to us to get there, but God bringing us.
And ultimately, who is God and who are we in relation to Him? Right? Is it about our comfort? Is it about our survival? Would we be willing to be sacrificed in the desert if it brought Him some glory?
I mean, they compared the Israelites to Stephen. In Stephen's situation, you see he's willing to die for God. He's trusting Him to the extent like, oh, God wants me to die now. Okay, I'm dying for God. And you see God is still providing for that situation, even though he's going through that stoning. God is still with him in that situation.
That whole, like, we don't have to, He absolutely wants us to engage our minds and understand everything as deeply as we can, okay? But we, at some point, got to put aside, I've got to understand this, versus God's asking me to do this, right? Do you have to understand? You know, and I was the little kid who was always asking, well, why, Mom? And I was always often told because I said so. So God is not, He has good reasons, and He's often long-suffering and patient with us, and will instruct us and will show us things, especially if we ask and seek Him. But there's also an element of the Christian faith where it's He's God and you're not. And are you ultimately sacrificing your life to His will for His glory and not your own understanding?
Yeah, because so the question that we're on is not this what we said to you in Egypt, leave us alone and that we may serve the Egyptians. Like, that's where they found their sense of peace and understanding, because they couldn't see past them. They didn't trust in the promises that God had given them, that Moses had reminded them of, that the plagues demonstrated the power of God that they served. They didn't demonstrate that level of obedience in the midst of what's going on now. They're like, well, this must be the end for us.
We'd rather serve these terrible people than live in the unknown of what's going to happen next.
Right.
While serving God.
Yeah. And so I would just point out, I was going to spend a little bit more time on this, but I would just point out there's a really strange and interesting connection between the phrasing here in verse 12, is not this what we said to you in Egypt, and also in Jonah chapter 4, verse 2, where Jonah calls out to God and says, is this not what I said to you back when you told me to go to them? There's an interesting connection in I'll leave that up to your own personal study.
Oh,
but
that's fun.
but the Hebrew is extremely interesting there. Not that I'm expecting you to go and delve into the Hebrew, but it's very, very similar in the way that it's constructed. And you can even hear the similarities there in the English. Is this not what we said to you when we were in Egypt? And then in 4:2, God, is this not what I said would happen if I came to Nineveh? Is essentially what he says in verse 4:2. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, even if you can't read Hebrew, like if you're looking at a translation that's worth its salt, you may be able to see that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I just wanted to mention that. I don't want to spend too much time on it because we want to get through the rest of the passage. But it's an interesting study that I would put to you, and maybe even come bring me back your thoughts. Let me know what you thought about it when you study it on your own. But it's super interesting. The correlations that can be drawn there between the Israelites and Jonah, but also the contrasts. Pay attention to all of that. Anyway, so let's move on. We're going to move on. Anyway, we're going to move on. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. Now, we move into verse 13, which is almost quoted exactly. And this is another point where I'm just going to drop a reference to you, and you can go and run it down on your own. But it is quoted almost exactly in 2 Chronicles 20, verse 7, when as words of encouragement to Jaziel, to King Jehoshaphat, which is a crazy interesting passage in which God is directing them and bringing them out of something. But anyway, so Moses says, this is the content of what is very similar in verse 13. And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." And this kind of leads to the last point. There again, there's an extreme similarity. I saw Jim looking it up.
What is it?
2 Chronicles 20, verse 17. And so, and it's the beginning statement there of Moses: "Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord." Again, it's very similar, different situations, but same application of God speaking to his people in the midst of difficulty and saying, "I will be here with you. I am the means by which you will win this fight. There is no other, right? I'm it." Which is kind of the whole point that we've been driving at since last week and this week, is that that's the whole point. There was no point, or there was no ability that they were going to have to get out of this. You get 600 fighting individuals of Egypt, one of the most elite militaristic nations on the planet at this time, driving down on a little over 6 million of you, right? 600,000 of you, depending on what numbers you look at. Anyway, and then you add the women and children and all that. But anyway, and so you have those people drilling down on you. You don't have a fighter among you. All you are slaves that have maybe a club, maybe the ability to build a tent. So you've got like a stake, but that's it. Like, you don't have any armor. You don't have the ability to fight off this extremely intense military that's bearing down on you. And God is saying to them, remember, fear not. You don't have to fear. Stand firm. Man, this whole verse right here could probably be its own little sermon. There's like, fear not, stand firm, and trust the salvation that is coming to you, right? See the salvation that the Lord will bring. The people are sitting here and they are fearful, but yet Moses is instructing them to put away that fear, stand firm in what they know to be true, and that is that God has promised them X, Y, and Z, right? The promises of their fathers, that he will bring us out. And then interestingly, he ends this by saying the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Again, which leads me to the last point there. Fearless are the faithful, for the Lord fights for them. Right. So I mean, this idea that God himself will be the warrior here. And again, this theme of God as warrior will be picked up in Moses' song in chapter 15. That's why I'm highlighting this so much, is because God as warrior is something that is celebrated in verse 15. Chapter 15. we don't often think of God in these terms. We don't often think of God as warrior. We think of God as 1970s hippie, normally, who came to us in love and peace and rainbows and sunshine, and that's it. Right? We don't often think about this God of passion and warrior-like mentality, who actively fights on our behalf. And I would extend that even to those that serve him, namely his messengers, his angels, who are fighting on our behalf, even in the spiritual realm that continues to rage around us. Right? There's a war that is happening every day, every minute, every hour, that oftentimes we don't think about very much. And this theme of God as warrior stretches from the beginning in creation all the way to Revelation. And we don't often spend much time thinking about it, but here is one place explicitly in the scriptures that we can focus on this aspect of God. What are your thoughts? I'm just going to, I know that's kind of a grenade and launching out there, but what are y'all's thoughts about this idea of God as warrior? Because if he is, we're not supposed to fear, right? We're not supposed to fear as we have going on here, because the explicit instruction is fear not, which, by the way, has been like the repeated theme of almost every Old Testament hero, if you want to paint them that. They're not really heroes, but the lineage of faith, right, up to this point. The same phrase has been said to them. Abram in Genesis 15:1, Isaac in 26:26, Jacob in 46:3, Hagar even is told this by God in 21:1. Like, I mean, this is a constant theme. And now it's being tied to this idea of God being warrior. Like, what are our thoughts about this? I'm going to shut up.
Even the angels said fear not to the shepherds in the New Testament too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the instruction continues.
You know, that's the same thing.
I was going to say, don't tell me what I think about God. I absolutely think of him as warrior and judge and king of all power and fully powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I often think of him that way. Powerful, creator, and redeemer are the three things that occur to me over and over and over again. And then the Holy Spirit is helper. And then, but you bring up a good point. I think of that more as God and Jesus. And there certainly culturally right now is this strong, this neutered image, a very loving, all-inclusive, not confrontational, almost stands for nothing other than peace, love, and happiness.
Right. And I guess that's what I didn't mean to insult what we think. I was just saying it's generally thought that is the portrait of Christ.
That's a good point.
And that's a portrait of God. God is Morgan Freeman, isn't he? Like, he's coming beside us to lovingly speak in that wonderful voice, right?
Morgan Freeman's not.
I'm just saying, right? And so I didn't intend to insult anybody here. My intention was to paint the portrait of what generally the thoughts about God are. They're not necessary. I don't know of a modern or a contemporary portrait of God in this manner in our culture. I don't know of any.
Can I just geek out for 2 seconds?
Oh goodness.
Yeah, does anybody does anybody watch professional wrestling? No. Okay, cool. All right, so WrestleMania 21, Triple H comes out to this song about Motorhead. I can't remember the name of it anymore, but they sang it live and everything like that. And he came literally came out of the stage on a throne and had a crown on and had just art this stuff on and everything like that. And I don't know why, but every time I hear it's a Christmas song, but he talks about like him Christ stepping off his throne. But I always have that picture in my head. I don't know why.
Wow.
It just looks so freaking cool to me, though.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it looks like he is a warrior. Like it's almost like a Viking kind of thing, like where he's gonna come and like fight and do battle and stuff like that. He lost, but
It's okay. It's not real anyway.
yeah, it's not real.
I don't mean to spoil the fun, but
I haven't watched wrestling in like 10, 12, 15 years.
except for 21.
Wrestling in 21. That was like 2005.
There's definitely a battle going on, whether we want to admit it or not. Let me let you get over that.
I know I'm gonna have that image in my head from now until like the next 3 Wednesdays till we get through the Song of Moses. Anyway,
Psalm?
the song.
Oh, Psalm.
Any other thoughts about this concept of God as warrior in contrast to what we see him portrayed as in our culture?
I think the reason it's, when like not talked about in our culture, but also, like for me, it's not hard for me to picture God like this because reading the stories, as you grow up, you hear the stories, and all this stuff, and like that, it's kind of like, that's who you learn God is, and like there's kind of a disconnect with Jesus, at the same time it's like, it's not hard for me to picture God like this, but I think for me, the disconnect of God as warrior is no one talks about it in modern terms. No one ever talks about God as warrior in that, oh, we're going to war, but God's on our side. Like no one, because it's almost like this unspoken thing of God's not involved in modern
Right.
And so, like, I think that's the disconnect for you. Like God is a warrior here, but then when we're told to fear not and stuff like that, our situation is not we're backed up against the notion with an army chasing us. Our situation is how am I going to pay the bills next year? And so, like, I think that's the disconnect for me with God as warrior is because A, it doesn't really apply to my life, but also even in modern terms, no one ever talks about him being involved in men's wars. You know?
Right, and I guess so. A couple of things, and we'll move off the topic, but a couple of things to try to bring some more modern understanding. That's why I related it to the spiritual warfare that rages around us all the time. Is because there is this sense in which we do battle. Like, there's a reason why Paul in most every of his letters uses warlike language when it's talking about our spirit against the flesh, right? There is this battle that is taking place, even in the midst of us who would claim Christ as our Savior, right? And we often hear the term, we put the flesh to death, right? We hear that phrase often, right? But we don't automatically equate it to there's a God who is warrior standing behind us that enables us to do this. And so that's how I normally connect those two things. And you're absolutely right. God is, we do disconnect it. This is a very different situation from all of modern wars, because there is not a theocratic society. Theocratic meaning that they solely bow themselves to God, right? There's not that type. Israel was supposed to be a theocracy, one which God ruled, and that's it. And then they mucked it up when they were like, yeah, we want a king just like everybody else. But anyway, and so this idea that God is supposed to be the one that leads them in battle, that does all these things, right? There is a disconnect for us between then and now, which I think has been, in my understanding of biblical theology anyway, as it relates to this topic of God as warrior, picks back up when we talk about we fight battles not against, like I said, flesh and blood, but principalities and rulers of the air and all that stuff. And he is actively involved just as powerfully as a warrior in that as well. I guess it's the connection that I would draw. I don't know if that makes sense or if that helps any in our understanding of this.
You ever read Frank Peretti's novels, Present Darkness?
I have not.
It's a novel form of spiritual warfare.
Yeah. So, and I want to mention also that all of these fears that God addresses here are normal, right? It's a normal fear to be fearful of an oncoming army when you don't have the ability to fight them, right? That's a normal fear. It's not somehow abnormal, like just cuckoo out in yaya land, right? That's not an abnormal fear. They're not also illusionary. This isn't like a fake army that's coming at them. Like these are real hardened warriors that are descending upon the people of God. And God does not lie to us about danger. He hasn't lied to them once throughout this entire narrative about danger that they will face, nor does he plant us in the idea or figments of our imagination in which we're geared to lose, right? He's not somehow manipulating them into a situation in which he will let them lose. He is in control completely and utterly. There is no one else that is controlling this. What he reminds us here is that even in frightening situations to us, while the fears are very real and normal, they will have to continue to trust in him. Like that's the crux of the matter. Will they continue to obey? Will they continue to trust? Will they continue to find rest and contentment in God? Not because of the absence of danger, but rather because of a God who fights for them and who has proved himself that he is one that they can trust in. Does that make sense? And so kind of bring 14 to a close at the end of our time together right now. So as we kind of move into now the answer, and we're going to go for another 5 minutes. Stay with me for a minute, up until verse 18. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you say to me, tell the people of Israel to go forward? Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them. And I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his hosts, his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen." We're going to push just a little bit further to verse 20. We're going to stop at 20, I promise. Then the angel of the Lord, who was going before the host of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them, coming between the host of Egypt and the host of Israel. And there was a cloud and darkness, and it lit up the night without one coming near the other all night. Now, as we get to the parting of the sea, right, as we kind of approach this subject, we're only going to deal with point 1 that I put up there, in God's protecting presence, right? This idea that God not only has promised to fight for them, but has promised to protect them in the midst of it. It's an important thing to point out toward the end of this chapter, and we'll hit it again next week, that it's a contrast that's being drawn between the Israelites and the Egyptians. It says in the text clearly, every single Egyptian died, not a one Israelite did. There's a direct correlate or contrast that's being drawn out in the text for the purposes of demonstrating this reality that God is not only a protector, but he is also a warrior on their behalf. So the miracle that we see here is obviously the pillar of fire moving from before them to behind them, and then disallowing the Egyptians from coming and essentially flanking them from the rear and overtaking them. Now, this section in 15 to 18, why is this section immensely important? Why do you guys think, what are you guys' thoughts about 15 to 18? Why is that kind of inserted?
The instructions.
Yeah, for the instructions and then the promise in verses 17 and 18. Because he's already said this, right? He said this back in verse 4. And now he's repeating it again. What's the whole axiom of biblical study. If it's said more than once, it's probably fairly important and probably deserves a little bit of attention.
Because the Lord, when he says something, he does it.
Okay, so it's reinforcing that he will be true to his word. Yeah, the the promise that the Egyptians themselves will know who God is, right?
It's almost like, what do you call it? Provenance or provenance or whatever.
Providence.
Provenance. It's like, let there be no doubt, I'm the artist here. I'm God here. This is me acting.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reinforcement that he is the one that's orchestrated this. He's the one, I like that analogy, the architect here. He's the master battle planner, if you want to put it. You may find it interesting that the Lord chastises Moses. What? Hold on a second. Like, as from Moses' perspective, I'm like, whoa, God, you do know that was them talking, right? I was the one that I was responding to them.
Maybe God knew he felt a little bit similar to them.
But would be in his character we've seen in the past.
It would be in his character, but it also points to the reality that the shepherd is responsible for the sheep. He is responsible for what is going on in Israel, even at his level. Even if, which I would think here he's actually following God, right? I don't see any semblance of Moses like, oh Lord, what are you going to do, right? I see Moses standing up and proclaiming, no, this is what God's going to do. This is what he has said he would do, right? But then God's like, why are you crying to me? Why are you crying to me? Don't you know what you should be telling them? Don't you know what the message that I've given you has been?
Especially since he literally repeats himself. Like, he tells Moses, this is what I'm going to do. And then Moses comes to him and is like, you're going to do it? And he's like, I told you I'm going to do it.
Yeah,
Are we there yet? Are we there yet?
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's this sense in which Moses is even the recipient of some chastisement from God and saying, no, like, you are responsible here. That's what I placed you over these people. And you are just as responsible for their behavior as you are for your own. There's an interesting tinge to that in this kind of chastisement of Moses here in verse 15. And he goes up, he's like, all right, lift up your staff and do this thing, stretch out your staff over the sea, divide it, that the people of Israel may go through on dry land. And then gets at what you guys were kind of pointing out. The repetition, the repeating of the promise that I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and at his heart being hardened, the Egyptians will bite on the bait and they will die. They will be judged. Now, I'm going to throw one more question and we're done. And we're just going to pick back up with the pillar of fire next week. One more question for us to kind of chew on. Maybe will lead us into next week. As he promises this, right, that the heart of Pharaoh will be hard, and the Egyptians will come in after them. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I've gotten glory over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. How is this similar to and or dissimilar to his previous statements after most of the plagues? So it's a two-part question. A, is it similar to what he says at the end of most plagues, right? I will gain glory over, they will know that I am the Lord, right? This idea. Mm-hmm. And if it is not completely similar, what are the dissimilarities?
Well, this one, I mean, he's stating that this is going to be the end, because he's going to get the honor over him, the chariots, and once you get the honor over him, this is it.
Yeah, there's a finality to it. Yeah, absolutely. So that would be a dissimilar.
Yeah, because he's going to win. This is it.
Yeah, checkmate.
I mean, he's not gonna get another chance. Pharaoh, he's not coming back and say, okay, here's another plague.
Yeah. And you may need to go back into the recesses of your memory when we were talking through some of the plagues and a conversation that we had about, well, is God being merciful in the midst of allowing them to persist in the land or in Egypt after plague after plague after plague, right? Is this an extension of God's mercy and him seeking to draw the Egyptians to an understanding of himself? Or is this just, as Jim wonderfully put, is this just God judging Egypt with no, is this just God's judgment and they will know him by his judgment?
But he knows the finale, either way it goes, right?
Yeah.
He knows what the end game is going to be. So,
Absolutely.
I guess his way is, he knows the way to do it because he knows, he knows if it went another way, he knows how Pharaoh would act and how the people would act. And he knows the outcome to, I guess, any kind of scenario, battle scheme, or any way you lay it out.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, that, and also God's movements here are not designed for just that moment in time then, but he's creating a trajectory for where all of history is headed. And if I remember my history correctly, in this moment, after this kind of moment in Egypt's history, Egypt was never quite as great as this ever again. And the decline of the Egyptian empire started here.
There's a slight resurgence about 100 years from this point, but yeah, generally it's degrading over time.
Yeah. So, I mean, God's using this to manipulate the world history and timeline in the direction where he wants it to go. Not only towards where the world where Christ finally exists and lives and dies and resurrects, but also to the end of time.
Yep.
He's showing, like you said, and like you said, he's showing his mercy and his influence that judgment both, right? At the same time.
Yeah, particularly
wipe them out right at the beginning.
Yeah, particularly in the plagues. There's this sense in which there is judgment with mercy being offered. And that kind of gets to what I think is going on here, as you pointed out, the finality of they will now forever and always know me by my name as judge. There is no more, like you have extinguished all of that which I had offered you, and you have continued to disobey. You've continued to reject me. You've continued to do this, and now you've come back after me after you've let us go, and now it's in game. This is it. There's finality to this point of judgment in predominantly verse 18 that he's talking about this, because he uses the same language in all the cases. You will know, right? The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I've gotten glory over Pharaoh. And so there's a finality to this moment that I think we would do well to remember, that there is, God is being judged here, and that is the end. And they will know him forever and always by this judgment. Because again, it's a very strong portion, at least, of their army. It's 600 of their best. It's a lot of their chariot forces. And now it will be cast into the sea as if it were nothing. So 2 things from tonight that I want us to remember, and we'll chew back on this topic. So think through those types of similarities and dissimilarities, judgment with God's offering of mercy, maybe in the plagues, and we'll pick this back up next week. But the 2 things for tonight to remember, big takeaways, are the reality of God as a warrior and his instruction to fear not in the midst of difficulty. Right? We can, in fact, trust him. We can find hope and rest in who he is, no matter the situation that we are placed in. Even if and again, this may be a grenade, but we're going to end tonight. Even if it is a situation of God's own making that we feel is discomfort, even in that circumstance, God is with us. God's presence still guides us, and he has promised to fight on our behalf. Okay, so those are the big ideas for tonight that I want us to kind of focus in on as we come back together next week. Any other final comments, questions, thoughts before we close out?
Thank you for preparing this tonight.
It was a pleasure. It's a lot of fun. I really do. Like, this has been so much fun. Studying the Exodus. Who would have thunk? This is great. So, all right, well, great. Would somebody like to close in the word of prayer? Okay.
Lord, thank you so much for bringing me to us here tonight. Thank you so much for giving Pastor Adam the wisdom and knowledge to bring us part of the word, in a way that we can all begin to understand even more the character, history, and how he worked through those in the past. God, just help us all not to hear all of this and then walk away and think about this, but instead just allow it to change how we live for you, more we live for you, become more Christ.
Amen. Thank you guys so much for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Pray that God's face will shine upon you. Remember, God loves you, and so do I.